The Mendez family are doing chores around their home. The water for the meal they're having this evening arrived directly to their home thanks to a community water project funded in part by the United States Agency for International Aid and Development, or USAID. Running water has been a life-changing upgrade for the family.
Life has changed because we now have water. We used to have to go all the way down to the hill to collect it, but all thanks to God, we now have our own water.
Across Guatemala, impoverished communities have received billions of dollars in aid from the United States over the years, money aimed at improving economic conditions and discouraging migration from the country. Despite these efforts, poverty has only worsened. Jonathan Mencos, an expert on economic development, says the solution isn't as simple as pouring more money at the problem.
The truth is the United States is the country that provides the most support to Guatemala and the three countries of North and Central America. The problem is that no international cooperation is going to substitute the need to establish functional public institutions for the development of democracy. That is a task that is ultimately up to the Guatemalan government.
Though some critics argue that international aid has fallen short of creating true economic stability, it doesn't mean that development projects have failed. From this central water tank, 95% of homes in 5 different indigenous communities now have access to clean water. The hope of development workers is that projects like these can be replicated across all of Guatemala. In the village of El Tizate, community leaders say the key to making international development projects like these successful is to make them sustainable.
We've received training on sustainability by USAID so that people can be more autonomous, because one day the donors will leave our community. But now we know how to maintain a healthy water supply.
U.S. President Joe Biden has pledged $4 billion to the governments of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to expand on programs like the Tizate Community Water Project. Here, the positive impact the program is having on the health and livelihoods of residents is clear. What's uncertain is if the Biden strategy will succeed where previous plans have fallen short and create the economic conditions necessary for Central America's poorest families to truly thrive. Now, we've known for some time that the Biden plan to curb migration from Central America is a departure from the strategies and policies of his predecessor, Donald Trump. Now, on the one hand, this visit by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris to Guatemala does represent a sort of reestablishing of that relationship between the United States and the governments of Central America under the guise of multilateralism. But what we're hearing overwhelmingly from development experts here in Guatemala specifically is that ultimately it is up to the Guatemalan government to make sure that foreign aid isn't lost to corruption, to make sure that that democratic institutionality doesn't lose its legitimacy. And without that, no amount of foreign aid is going to solve the problems that are forcing people in Central America, specifically countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to risk their lives fleeing north toward the United States.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much, Manuel Rapalo, for that reporting from the Guatemala border. Talks, in fact, are expected to focus on the so-called Northern Triangle countries in Central America. Those are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So most people in the region either live in poverty or they work in the informal sector, leaving them without support or protections. The coronavirus pandemic has made their situation even worse. Many are now fleeing to escape crime and corruption. El Salvador and Honduras have the highest homicide rates in the world. And in 2014, the Obama administration gave $750 million to address the root causes of migration in the Northern Triangle. In 2019, that aid was frozen by Donald Trump. And now President Joe Biden wants to increase it to $4 billion. Let's now speak to William Lawrence, who's a professor for international relations at the American University. He's joining us from Washington. Thanks for your time with us on Al Jazeera. So Kamala Harris's press secretary has said that she is picking up where the then Vice President Joe Biden left off when he himself worked on this portfolio under the Obama administration. But how do you think this time, in fact, going to be different than the attempts by previous U.S. administrations? And what's your sense of what we can actually expect from this trip?
Well, let me say that these problems are long-term structural problems that take years to solve. But it's much better to do something, as your excellent report indicated, than to not do something. And so it's great that Kamala Harris and President Biden have negotiated this new package of assistance, including another $300 million for hurricane relief and drought relief, and then a whole suite of new cooperative packages. And there'll be several announcements related to that over the coming days, because you have to simultaneously both deal with the border issues, where there's been some improvements despite the surge, and the systemic issues that send so many migrants headed for the border. And that's the right approach. And finally, we're getting that reestablished. In terms of Kamala Harris, she's had some friction with the president of Guatemala. He did some interviews over the weekend in which he was critical of some of her approaches, including her focus on corruption, which is, of course, connected to the development issue. But this is Kamala Harris developing her foreign policy chops. It's a priority of the Biden administration to allow her to have some lead on foreign policy issues in preparation for 2028 or 2024 elections. And so far, so good. She's doing all the right things, saying all the right things, and getting some diplomatic practice. It's very hard sometimes for politicians to get used to the idea that sometimes in diplomacy you have to be publicly conciliatory and privately tough. And that's something that she'll be practicing during this trip.
Right, but how would you define success of this trip when it will obviously take some time to see the results of this diplomacy by Kamala Harris and the investment that she's putting forward?
So, for example, the president of Guatemala wants to start extradition of narco-traffickers and other criminals to U.S. courts. That's something they can have an announcement on. New law enforcement and judicial cooperation, which hasn't been announced. That's something they can cooperate on. The president of Guatemala sees his primary issues is narco-traffickers and their deleterious effects on Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, something we haven't really done that well on. So on that, let's say, law enforcement and security side of the coin is where we've had the least progress, whereas on the pure economic and developmental side, the pandemic and the vaccine, things related to climate change, drought, we've had much more progress. But on the law enforcement side, I think is where they could have the most important gains going forward.
Look, I mean, Republicans over in the U.S. are saying that the administration needs to do much more to stem the flow of migrants. And in fact, April saw pretty high numbers, in fact, record numbers of migrants trying to cross over into the U.S. So how much political pressure is the administration under, and Kamala Harris herself, to stem the flow of migrants?
Tremendous political pressure, and the Republicans are right about the issue, even if they're politicizing it often in unfair ways. But what happened is that the Biden administration implemented a humane policy that said basically children at the border are going to be treated humanely and integrated into U.S. assistance and into their families. A lot of them have relatives in the United States. And that's what created the surge, as the president of Guatemala said. The coyotes were recruiting literally the day the policy was announced. So the U.S. has to do a much better job at the border, particularly in regards to how children are treated. And to that end, the U.S., I think, has run now 30,000 advertisements in the Northern Triangle countries to try to stem the flow. It's trying to be clearer on which children will be repatriated back towards those countries into Mexico. And it's trying to reduce the flows. But right now, we've had this tremendous surge. And it's really nobody's fault. It's under international law, you have to treat children humanely, as we saw recently between Morocco and Spain. I mean, you really have to separate out the children, but that creates these new supply, let's say, migration issues that have to be dealt with in an intelligent way. And a lot of that's about, as you've said, economic development and proper messaging.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us from Washington, D.C., William Lawrence.